Okay, so now we've talked about sampling last week. Now this week we're going to talk about survey research. So survey research is pretty simple. It's essentially making up some sort of document, and oftentimes it's done electronically nowadays, where you just ask people a bunch of questions about whatever you're interested in researching. And I think last week we were talking about drunk driving, so we'll probably stick with that to some extent. Why not? That's what a lot of my research is on, so it's easy for me to make it applicable. Anyway. So, talking about survey research, it is pretty frequently used in sociology, criminal justice, poli-sci uses it a lot, and you've probably been sent some sort of surveys at some point in time in your life or time as a student here. So you should have some experience, at least on that end of things. Um, One of the things that we do is we use surveys to count crime, especially self-reported crime. Remember, we talked about the problems before with using the official data to count crime because that's what's known as that dark figure of crime, right? Where we don't actually know how much crime is being committed. Well, we can use surveys to actually test this and actually figure out and get some estimates of that. You might want to also look at perceptions of attitudes about different things, maybe attitudes about the death penalty. Students usually are interested in attitudes about marijuana legalization nowadays. So these are some other things that you can look at with survey data. Um, and many students in the past have actually used this as part of their research proposal. And so there's certain guidelines for asking questions, and there's some different ways of doing it as well. And so there's open-ended questions where you just might say, tell me about your marijuana use opinions. And then a closed-ended questions might be, do you approve or disapprove of legalizing marijuana? So that would be differences between those. Your choices for the closed-ended ones must be exhaustive and mutually exclusive. So you don't want to ask, do you approve of legalizing marijuana? And some people don't have any opinion on that. So you want to put in maybe an option for don't know, don't care, or something like that. And you also want to make sure that they're mutually exclusive. So like yes and no are two different ones, and that's pretty easy. But you don't want to ask people something that could be complicated, such as maybe even nowadays, what is your race or gender? These things are often not mutually exclusive. If we just ask whether you identify as male or female, you could identify as something else, and so the male or female responses would not just be mutually exclusive. So you want to make sure that you make your items clear. Short items are the best. Avoid negative items, especially double negatives. So do you not approve of this? That would equal approving of it, but that would confuse people and cause some issues with that. I know when I used to go vote in Virginia, they would ask the survey questions that were these long legalese, drawn up things, and I have a PhD and I couldn't hardly understand what they were trying to ask. So you'd want to try not to do that. Because that will affect your responses. If people don't know what the question is, then chances are their answers aren't going to be that great either. So there's other things known as contingency questions. And so there's contingency questions mean that they're only related to a previous question. So a paper I just wrote had a filter question, which is they asked if the people had consumed any alcohol in the past 12 months. And so if they said yes, then they were asked these contingency questions, which asked about the frequency of alcohol use and whether they drank at bars and drank and drive afterwards and things like that. Um, but if they answered no, I haven't drank any alcohol at all in the past 12 months, then they would never have been asked these contingency questions about their alcohol use and whether they drank and drive because we already know that they haven't drank any alcohol in the past 12 months. Uh, so there's matrix questions too, and these are usually on Likert scales where you'll have 1 to 5, and then maybe you'll at the top, and they ask you to rank a whole bunch of different stuff from 1 to 5. Uh, and so these are really handy because you don't have to reread and figure out the whole matrix each time, the whole order of the question and what 1 to 5 means and all this stuff, and so you can answer a bunch of different questions much faster. It'd be very similar to the makeup of your course evaluations. You think about you do course evaluations every semester, which is a survey, right? It's not based on a sample that's representative of the class because it's just whoever actually fills them out, rather than the whole class doesn't do it, and then it's not a random sample. It's just the people that dislike this class the most. Trying to make a joke there. Maybe you laughed, maybe you didn't. Who knows? But you want to order the things in a good way that makes sense. Usually, what you want to do is you want to ask your most important questions first, because sometimes students will get, or not students, respondents will get bored towards the end if you ask a bunch of boring stuff, and they'll tell you they don't want to answer any more questions and stuff like that. Um, and so you want to ask the most interesting stuff first. It's actually the opposite with in-person interviews, but we'll talk about that when we get to interviewing. Um, so self-administered questionnaires, these things can be home delivered. You can go and deliver them. They could be mailed to people, and then they mail them back. Uh, you know, One of the most common now is to do it electronically, like I said. But if you do mail things that address correction cards, there could be address issues. You should have a cover letter that, tells the people what the survey is about, what it's being used for, your institutional affiliation, stuff like that. You want to monitor the number of responses that you get. This is known as the response rate. This is very important because most of the time when people receive a survey, they throw it away and they don't do it, right? How many people have been guilty of that one? Yeah. Or you get an email one and you just delete it. Or you might not have even gotten it because it might have gone to your junk file. So usually we consider 50% to be good, even though it's really hard to get to that. Most commonly, you'll see response rates in the 20s, and that's better than a really low one. But if the response rate is low, that can bias your ability to generalize that, right? Because then your whole sample hasn't replied. Your whole random sample, it messes up your randomization in your sampling. Like I said, uh, fax, email, websites, all that stuff. You'll probably heard of SurveyMonkey. SurveyMonkey is great when you can create your own surveys, and then what it does is it actually puts it all into like this spreadsheet for you, so you don't even have to do the data entry, which is really awesome. Um, so, in-person interview surveys, you get a higher response rate for in-person interviews, if you can imagine, than you would mail one, because people are less likely to tell you no in person versus just throwing away the piece of junk mail that they got, which we all get tons of every day. Demeanor and appearance is very important, especially when you're interviewing people about criminal justice issues. You want to be very careful, and you're going to have to go through the IRB to make sure that you don't do anything inappropriate. Now, you can ask and probe for additional responses in these, or you can't do that. So if someone says they approve of legalizing marijuana, you can ask them why. Now you could build that into your survey too, but that's if you foresee that you want to know this information. Sometimes you might be collecting information that you might not know to ask why or ask these follow-up questions, which can make those in-person interviews a little bit better. But of course, they're much more time-consuming, right? So assisted interviews. This is a relatively newer thing where people read questions from the screen and then type the answers. And this just goes directly into the computer while you're doing it. Saves a little bit of time. Self-interviewing is very similar to an online survey. It's just the respondent answers the stuff, themselves, and then the interviewer can't access, these different things that they've responded to and figure out who the person was that said them. That can help. Some people might be more forthcoming if they don't have to actually tell the person about it, but they can actually type it in themselves, and they don't have kind of this social desirability issue that can arise. So it really depends on what you're researching. You want to think about all of these things thoroughly. Telephone surveys. 95% of all households have a telephone in 2005. I would venture to say that that has probably gone way down when it comes to landlines, and most people are using cell phones nowadays. I know we don't have a landline. My parents have a landline, and they don't answer it. It just came as a package deal, and all they get is telemarketers calling that, or the random spam. So, mobile phones are much more prolific nowadays, and what they do is they randomly dial digits, which is very similar to what the telemarketers and stuff do, which is why telephone surveys are very difficult to get people to, reply to, and because they just assume that it's a regular, you know, uh, telemarketer or spam things rather than social science research. Um, Computer assisted telephone interviewing. This is very similar to the computer assisted interviewing that you would do in person. It's just you do it over the phone. So, you can automate things. So you can automate these contingency questions and skip sequences. If people answer no to drinking, it'll skip a whole bunch of stuff. Um, Now you can't let them know that though, because if they know that they're not going to have to answer a whole bunch of questions, if they answer this question one way, then they're more likely to answer that question that way. So of course you don't want to tell them this ahead of time. Um, so comparing the three methods, self-administered questionnaires are generally cheaper, but for sensitive issues, than interviews, you might want to use those. Interviews, people don't really like to talk about sensitive issues when they're looking at another person. Then that can come to some IRB issues and human subjects. Um, Local and national surveys using the mail are about the same. The stamps are pretty cheap, but that can add up. Interviews are usually the most expensive, the most time consuming, but they have higher completion rates. The validity is low, but the reliability is high in survey researchers. Surveys are also kind of inflexible and superficial. So the interviews can kind of allow you a lot more flexibility in there. Strengths of survey research are particularly useful in describing large populations. Standardized questionnaires can ensure uniform responses and measurement. That's important too because if you do interviews, you have different people doing the interviews. They might conduct them different way. I know when I was in graduate school, my dissertation chair, he had some different or issues with getting people to tell him things when he was doing interviews. But then he had some young blonde, graduate students go do the interviews, and then people would tell her anything that they wanted to know. So that can really bias your results, if depending upon who the researcher is and the person asking the questions. So that's not so much an issue when it comes to your survey research. As interviews, have that subjectivity and stuff. Um, so standardizing things often leads to representing the least common denominator and assessing people's attitudes, orientation, stuff like that. And that's kind of a weakness of that. You would get a lot more information. The young blonde graduate student got a lot more information, but you could only really use her information. You couldn't compare what people told her to what they told to the old professor. And so that's really an important thing to think about when you're planning your research studies. Are you interested in getting more in-depth information, or are you more interested in being able to apply that information you get to a larger population, so to speak? Um, Mail surveys, less expensive things when you're thinking about doing things yourself. Now, keep in mind too that you don't actually have to do this study. So you can pretend like you have $1 million grant when you're writing up this proposal for your class, and you don't actually have to go out and do it. So, really the sky's the limit. You don't have to consider startup costs and things like that because you don't have to actually do it. You don't have to get the money. So really think about that when you're developing your proposals for the class, and think about, all this cool stuff that could be done, and really show me how much you've learned in the class. So anyway, with that, I will sign off, and I will talk to you all next week. And I hope you have a good week. And please don't forget your discussions and quizzes. All right, bye.